everyone, welcome back to our Node.js crash course. In this video, we'll be exploring the file system or FS module. This module is essential for working with files and directories in Node.js. It's one of the most popular core modules in Node.js, and it's something that you're going to be coming across in your professional journey. So let's get started. The FS module in Node.js really allows you to interact with the file system on your computer. You can read, write, delete, manage, and even watch files and directories using this FS core module. It's one of the core modules in Node.js, and you do not need anything at all to install it. So enough talk, let's get started on how to really use the file system module. So as is custom with our tutorials, I'm going to have a info.txt here, right? And I'm just going to say a couple of things here. Of course, as I said before, the FS module is used for major tasks, which is reading files, writing into files, updating files, watching file changes, and managing general like directory management. And we're going to try to take this one after the other and try to make it as easy to understand as possible. I'm going to be giving a couple more ways to do some tasks, and you can choose to do what you want to do based on your preference. But just hop right into it right now and leave this info.txt file. But this is generally the use cases of using the FS module. Awesome. So let's start with the first thing. We remember from the last video when we were talking about modules, we can bring in our core modules the same way we'll bring in any module, but we do not need to install anything extra. And in this case, we just declare a variable. We call the variable fs, and we assign it to require fs, which brings the fs module to the file context and exposes all of its properties as well as methods. Perfect. So let's read a file. And of course, to read a file, we need to have a file present. Conveniently, we have our info.txt file. You can literally read any file you want to read. You can even read a CSV file. You can read any file, right? So we're going to start with this info.txt file though, and let's try and make it work right now. So how do we read a file? We saw this in the previous video on this topic, but we didn't really cover it in great detail. In this video, we're going to cover it in great detail. So here's how we read the info.txt file. We say fs.read file. And read file is one of the methods that FS module has. And what is the first argument that goes into the read file function? The first argument, of course, is the directory path of the file, which is info.txt. So how we generally do that is we say ./info.txt. And the second argument, of course, is the format of the file that we want to read, which is UTF-8. And the third argument, is going to be the function that gets called once the file has been successfully read by the read file method. So how do we write this function? Of course, we can write an ES6 function here, an ES6 arrow function here, and we can then populate the arguments with, as I said before in the previous video, the error as well as the data that has been read. And if there's an error in reading the file, let's say by the file path not being correct, we need to log the error or at least find out what is causing the error, right? So we say if there's an error, we want to, in this case, return console.log error, which means there is an error with our file reading process. And if there is no error, we're going to go down and say we want to console.log the data. In reality, in production, we would want to do something with this data, maybe save it to a database or parse and information from it to infer something from that file. There are many things we can do with the read file module. It's a really powerful module. That's enough talk. So let's see how this can work. As I said before, and how to run this file, we say node server and press enter. And as we can see, all the contents of the file have been read. And this is the asynchronous way of making things work. Next, we're going to look at the synchronous way of making this work as well. So when I say this is the asynchronous way of making this work, I simply mean that this read file operation does not wait or block the process of running the file. So when we do read file, it occurs without blocking the loop. Things occur asynchronously. And I'm going to explain that by showing you an example. Let's say I do fs.readFile and keep everything as is, and I log console.log I love pizzas and save, and I run this file again by saying node server. You see, I love pizzas came as a log before the file that was being read. Why is that? That is because fs.readFile does not block the loop process. This just runs in the background and continues the lines of code, ignores this callback function, doesn't execute it, and then moves on to console.log I love pizzas. This is just the asynchronous way of making things work. And there are times where this is useful, and there are times where it's not that useful, but I will explain why in a short while. If you want to do these things in the synchronous way of doing things, I'll show you the difference very shortly, and this is how it works. Let me comment this out and say I want to do this synchronously, so I'm going to save the results into a variable called info file. And I'm going to say fs.readFile. In this case, I'll do read file sync. And this, of course, takes in the path info.txt, and then it takes in the format of reading the file. And that is all it takes. This tries to read the file synchronously. So this first one tried to read it asynchronously. I can spell. The second one tries to read it synchronously. And I can't spell synchronously. If we try to log this now, we see, let me just try to console.log the info file, of course. If I try to log this to the console, what I'll see is I love pizzas comes after the file read and log. So we have to wait for the file to be totally read before the log was done at the bottom. So this is very essential if you want to keep your code clean, away from all the excess curly brackets that may occur as a result of using the asynchronous process. So it has its own use cases. It just depends on what you want to do in a particular point in time in your code. We will indeed be using more of the fs module in future. What happens though if we type in the wrong path? You can see that the code terminates because we didn't add a proper error handling procedure for this. So if you want to use the synchronous way of doing things, you need to add an extra error check to make sure your code is fully checked. And how do we do that? Is we say try catch. We need to make a try catch block. If you are conversant with JavaScript, this should not look very foreign to you. It's a very common way of catching errors. So what we do is we put in this read file sync operation into the try block. And then if there is an error, if it does not read the file, we say catch error and console.log the error that occurred, right? And of course, since I am now block scoping the variable declaration, I need to carry the logs into the scope here, the try scope here. Perfect. So I am going to log this again and see what happens. You can see that. Perfect. You can see that obviously we don't get the pizza log, but let me just, I need to take a piece of pizza log away from the try block. But here, this is better. So I'm going to try this again. Oh yeah, you can see it showed the error happened, but it still logged I love pizzas. So pretty much it's going to make sure that this error is localized and doesn't crash the entire code. So that's why if we're using the synchronous way of reading the file, we need to, of course, make sure we protect our code by try catching it. It just depends on your preference. These are both wonderful ways of doing this. Awesome. So let's move on to the other one, which is writing to a file. So how do we do that? I'm going to comment this out and say writing to file. And I want to write a content to a brand new file. And I want to call that file, I'm going to name the file, of course, but before I write what the file is called, I want to write the content. And the content of this file is, well, because I love pizzas so much, I love pizzas, right? And how do I write to the file? Again, there are two ways of writing to a file. The first way is asynchronously, as we have learned, and the second way is synchronously. I'm going to be using the asynchronous version for this and say fs.write file, right? And the first argument is the name of the file. I'm just going to call this file thingsIlove.txt, right? And thingsIlove.txt is what I call the file. And I'm going to come here and say, what is the next argument? It is the content I want to write into the file. Awesome. And the next argument, of course, is the format of the things I'm going to write in the file, which is UTF-8. And the next argument, of course, is the callback function that is executed once the writing operation is done. And there's nothing much here, just one argument, which is the error, because we're not expecting any data back. We are not reading, we are writing to a file. So that is exactly what is happening here. Awesome. So, of course, if there is an error, we want to return console.log error, right? And if there is no errors, we just console.log, we are done writing to the file. Perfect. So let's run this code and quickly see. So I'm going to run node server, and we get the message, the log, we are done writing to this file. And if we go to this file list, we see there's a brand new file there called thingsIlove.txt. And if I open it, we can see clearly, I love pizzas, right? Because that is what we wrote as the content into the thingsIlove.txt. Perfect. And of course, there's an error here. This should not be error. This should correlate, of course, with this as well. This little typo here, make sure to fix this and make all these error declarations to be the same thing. So of course, the synchronous way of doing things will be very, very similar to this. Synchronously, just to do it. This is the last time I'm using synchronous methods of doing things. It's pretty much the same thing. So as not to take too much time with the video. Without the synchronous way of doing things here, you can just say thingsIlove.txt, and I want to write the content. And of course, this would be UTF-8. And this is pretty much it. And obviously, we need to protect it with the try-catch block in case there is an error. So take this over here, and then we console.log the error. So that is that. I'm gonna this is the asynchronous version. Async. I'm gonna comment the async one out, and I'm going to run this program. Let me see. It's still gonna be I love pizzas. That's there, but just to prove that it works, I love pizzas a lot is what I did the contents to, and I'll run the code again by typing node server. And if I open this, I will see I love pizzas a lot, because this is the async method of doing things. Perfect. To make things much clearer, now that I'm looking at this, I'm going to make a new file for the next FS use case examples. So the next FS use case example, of course, is the update of a file. According to our info.txt, so we can update files. We can append to a file. That's what it's called, append. So let's make a new JS file called append.js. And I'm going to bring in fs as I usually do bring fs. And I want to append to our thingsIlove.txt file. And how do I append to the file? I'm going to make a variable called additional content and say, I love roller coasters. Yeah. And to make this to be a new line in thingsIlove here, make this into a new line, I'm just going to come here and say, just at the beginning of the text, I'm going to write a /n. And what this does is it's communicates to our programming language to make sure that this enters into a brand new line when we append the additional content to the thingsilove.txt file. So let's just do that right now, and I'll say fs dot, and the name is append file. Of course, there's an asynchronous way of doing things. It's really going to be the same process, so I'm not going to repeat the asynchronous way of doing things. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in below on how to do the asynchronous way. You can do that as an assignment on your own. So I'm just going to say I'm going to append to thingsilove.txt. And of course, that's the first argument, the file path. That's usually always is the first argument. And of course, I'm going to have additional content there. And of course, it's going to be in UTF-8, 99 times out of 100. And the next argument is going to be the callback function when the operation is done, whether it is an error or it is a complete operation. Awesome. So if it's an error, I'm going to return console.log error. Else, I would just say console.log done appended file. Perfect. So let's see if this works. I'm going to say node append, in this case, no longer server, since it's the append file, append.js, and I'm going to press enter and see what happens. You can see I get the message here, done appended file. If I check the thingsilove.txt, I see that, of course, I get the I love roller coasters in a new line. And this extra space is here because I made a space here, an error, but there shouldn't be a space here. I'm just save that and let me, you know what? Let me leave it like this and run the code, and so you can see it get appended in real time properly. So when I say node append.js, you can see it appends the I love roller coasters without any white space here. Awesome. So this is pretty much how append works. Of course, we know how to append sync. I'm not going to go into that because you probably know by now that it's the same formula. Just take off the callback function and make this sync, and you're good. So we're going to move on to something else right now, which is, of course, deleting files. So I'm not going to delete the things I love because I love those things. I'm just going to make a brand new file here by clicking on this new file icon, or right clicking and clicking on new file. I'm going to click on the new file icon right now, and I'm going to call this file to delete.txt. And after I make that new file, I'll say this is the file you want to delete. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to make a new file again called delete file.js. And of course, I'm going to bring in fs and require fs. And I'm going to try and delete this file to delete.txt. And of course, to do that, I'll do fs.onLink. There's also an onLink sync, but I'm going to do onLink, which is the asynchronous way of deleting a file. And of course, onLink sync is the synchronous way of deleting a file. I'm going to call this first argument, which is the file I want to delete, file to delete.txt. And the second argument, of course, I'm not going to write or update or read anything. So there's no format argument or anything. There's no UTF-8 to put there. It's just going to be the callback function that has an error. And if there's an error, of course, I want to return console.log error. And if there is, I'll just correct this real quick. If there's no error, console.log done deleting file. Perfect. So I'm going to run this code and say node delete file, and watch over here, the left panel, and see how the file to delete gets deleted here. We can see that the file to delete disappears from the left-hand panel. Perfect. What happens if we try to delete a file that does not exist? Of course, it's going to throw an error. That goes without saying. So let's just try and see it. So you can see we get this error, ENOENT, no such file or directory onLink, right? So that's generally how that works. So that's just it. That's just how it works on this. So the next thing I would want to do is I would want to talk about directory management, which is like a folder management or what you want to call it. The first thing I want to do for that is create a new folder. I'll call this folder important files. And I'll just say here that I'm going to create a new file as well. And I'll call this new file manage dirs or manage folders, right? .js. I'm going to bring in fs and require fs as well. And I want to do a couple of things here. I want to make a directory. I want to read that directory, and I want to remove that directory. What that means is when I make the directory, in fact, I don't really need this important files yet. I'm going to make this automatically. So let me just delete this real quick. Sorry about that. I want to make a directory. I want to read the contents of the directory, and I want to actually remove and delete the directory. So what I'm going to do is just a little small assignment or small exercise we're going to do here in directory management. And it's going to go like this. fs dot make directory. This is the simple way to make a directory. Making a directory. I'll just put that as a comment. So that's a simple way to make a directory. And what do we want to call the directory? We want to call the directory example directory, or maybe we just call this important files, right? And the second argument is a callback function that comes when, of course, there is an error with the directory making process. And if there's an error, we want to console.log error, right? And I'm going to show you the cool part of using the synchronous methods as opposed to the asynchronous methods in a very short while. But let's just continue using purely asynchronous all through this current example. So after the directory has been created and we have no errors, we want to move on and say console.log folder created, right? And then we want to read the contents of the folder, which is going to be empty, of course, because there is no content yet. So I'm going to say read directory or folder or whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing. I can say fs.read directory. The first thing that comes in here is going to be the name of the directory, which is important files. And the second argument is going to be the error and the files inside of this. And you know what I want to do? I want to make this even much more, I'll show you the importance of using the asynchronous method even more. So before I write this line, I'm going to make new files inside of this important files directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if you remember how to make files, it's fs.write file. I'm going to make this asynchronous as well and say, I'm going to write a file into important files, put an underscore files, and I'm just going to call this file 1. And the content of the file is going to be, hey, I am important. Remember, the second argument of writing a file is the content of the file. And maybe just put this in here as content and make a variable called content. Const content is equal to this. And then the next argument, of course, is the callback function that says there's an error if there's an error, right? And I'm going to say if error, again, I'm going to return console.log error, right? And you can see that this is already starting to become very janky and curly brace hell. So, but let's continue and we can see how we clean this up later. So we're going to write a file into important files. So what happens is we created the important files directory and we are writing a file into important files. And I want to read the important files directory by saying fs.read dir. And to read directory, I'm going to say /important files, or I can just say important files pretty much. And after I read the directory, of course, I expect a couple of things. I expect to have a second argument that has the error and the files in the directory. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to copy this line from the top and paste this here. And I'll say console.log files, right? I'm going to save this. So you can see this is already getting very messy because there's a lot of like curly braces here and it's hard to tell what starts and what ends where. So let me just run this and see how it works. And if it works, we're going to change this to a whole different setup entirely. Perfect. So let me just say node manage folders and see if we'll get anything. Awesome. So we can see here, if you go through the logs, we see we have created a folder called important files and made a file 1 instead of important files. So we first of all made the directory important files. We added a file to it and put the content in the file, which is, as you can see here, hey, I am important in file 1. And we read the file content, which is file 1, right? Perfect. So let's make this look a little better with synchronous programming. One rule of thumb I go by is if the next file system operation depends on the result of the previous FS operation, then you most likely want to use a synchronous operation to make this work. One way of editing this is I would just say, let me just, you know what? I'm just going to create a new folder called manage folders synchronous.js. And I'm going to say here that I'm going to bring in FS, of course, real quick, require FS. And the first thing I'm going to do, let me just delete this important files here. And we're going to see how neat this process is going to be. So we'll say fs.mkdir, which is making a new directory. I'm going to call this, this is going to be sync, of course. I'm going to call this directory important files. And this should be a try-catch. It should be in a try-catch block, of course. I'm going to put this in a try-catch block. And if there's an error, of course, I want to say console.log error, right? And I want to say fs.write file sync. I'm going to write into important files, file 1. And I'm going to call this important files, hey, I am important. I'm going to put this inside of file 1, inside of the important files folder. And of course, this is UTF-8. And then the next step is I'm going to read fs.read the directory and see the contents of important files. We can see how small this code, just 3 lines of code, well, excluding the try-catch block, of course, but you can see how small and neat this has quickly become as opposed to our manage folders code, which has a lot of curly braces. So that this is one of the importance of sync. And of course, I've got to add the sync here for the last one. And I can save this in a variable and say const files, and I will console.log files. And if I quickly just, I'm going to say console.log directory made, and I'll say console.log file created, right? So after a directory is made, I say directory is made here, and after the file is created, it says file is created, and then we read the file and we log it. It's still way shorter, even with the logs, which is crazy, right? It's still way shorter. Awesome. So let's run this code. In this case, it'll be node manage folders sync. You can see we get the exact same effect, but much shorter and much readable than the previous code, which is barely readable. Awesome. So I just want to show you guys how to manage folders and manage directories and make all of that work perfectly. So the next thing I want to show you guys is just a small thing, but you can actually delete a directory. But unfortunately, you cannot delete a directory when there are files in the directory. You need to, of course, delete the files first before you delete the directory or folder. So just to show you a brief description of this and how the error is going to be when you try to do that is you can just say, if I come to the bottom here, fs.remove or rm dir sync. I want to remove important files, right? And if I try to do this, of course, I'm going to have an error. But let me just show you the error in real time. I say node manage folders sync. See, I get an error that E exists is the code. Of course, file already exists inside of the important files. So that cannot work. Of course, I'm going to delete this folder again, real quick. So if we want to do this, let's say we're done with using this file, how do we make it work and delete the folder after our operation? So here's how we do it. We need to delete all the files inside of the folder before we do that, right? So how do we do that? Let's say we have multiple files in here, like so many files. How do we make that work? So we just use a simple for loop. We say let I equals 0. And if you know some JavaScript, you know control structures like for loops. very simple to write. So I less than files.length. So we want to loop over all the files that are inside of important files, and we want to delete them. So how do we delete them? We say fs.unlink sync and unlink all the files. So how do we get the file? The file is called files I. So this is the file name. It's going to be the index of the files. In this case, it's only one file, but there could be like a million files in here that you want to delete. Maybe not up to a million, but there could be a lot more files you want to delete here, and you would like to unlink the files. We learned unlink before, so that's not such a big deal. So I'm going to pass an unlink here, file. And of course, maybe if there's an error, you can put a try catch block here, but I know there's not going to be an error, so I'm just going to leave it like this, because I am indeed unlinking only the files that are present in the file directory. So with this, it's probably going to work now, and it will be almost like we didn't see anything over here because everything will be deleted. So let's just run the code now and see. We have an error. Let's see. There is no such file called file1. Let me quickly investigate this. Yeah, of course, there's no file called file1. That's because we didn't look into the important files directory. Common mistake. I'll just come here and say important files and say, let me just use template strings for this real quick and just make this work real quick and say file. This should certainly work because I'm now referencing this file inside of this directory. There's still an error. Why is there an error? File already exists. Okay, that is my bad. It didn't work because the important files was already here. So clearly we can recreate the same file. And I'm kind of glad that error showed up in the first place because important files, we can't make a file in the same place with the same name is going to throw an error. So that is exactly what happened here. So just going on and trying to do this again real quick. I'll just do node manage folders sync. And we see that, of course, this will work because we are unlinking every single file in the directory, and it's going to be as if nothing even happened here to the left. See, nothing has been created but if we check the logs, we do know that things have been created. The directory was made, the file was created, this was found, and then we deleted it successfully and removed the directory. To make that much clearer, I'm just going to say console.log file deleted, and at the end of the file, I'll say console.log. At the end of the code, I'll say console.log folder deleted. So if I run this code again, and in VS Code, you can, of course, make this work by pressing the up button to run the last command, and I pressed enter. You can see I get all the logs, the files deleted, and the folder is deleted, so nothing happened here. So we're almost at the end of this, I promise. There's a lot to cover. This is an in-depth, detailed crash course, of course, and I would like to cover this to the best of my ability. So the next thing we're going to talk about is watching files for file changes. That is the final thing we're going to talk about right now. So we're going to handle the watch file now, and for that I'm going to make a new file called watch.js. I'm going to bring in fs like usual and make it require fs. And I'm also going to say, I want to watch the things I love.txt. And I'm going to watch the things I watch.txt and say fs.watch. And I'm going to say, I want to watch things I love.txt. And the callback function is going to run every time the file has been changed or any form of event happens on that file at any point in time. So here's how it's going to work. I'll say the first argument, of course, is the events type. The second argument is the file name. And when there is a change in things I love.txt, it's going to, run this callback function. I'm just going to console.log the event type as well as the file name. So event type, I'm going to type in event type here in the console.log and call this event type. And then I'm going to copy this and say file name. This will show us being more useful in a short while, of course. So if I run this code and say node watch.js or just node watch, then if I go to things I love and put pizza and save, we see I get that there's an event type here that runs. The event type is called a change, and the file name is things I love, and I need to change this to file name instead of an event type in the second log I have going on here. File name. Let's run this code again, and if I change it again and say ice cream, you see I get events type is changed, things I love. File name is things I love.txt. If I change this file from things I love to things I hate, of course the file name here then changes, and we can see that there's a rename event type that runs. So this is actually pretty useful, and I'll show you a particular use case just right now. So let me just I'm going to leave it as things I hate, and I'm going to say if the event type is equal to a change, I want to just log the new contents to the console, right? How I'm going to log the new contents? I'm going to read the contents. I'm going to say const new content is equal to fs.read file, in this case read file sync, and I'm going to read the contents of things I love.txt, and I'm going to read it in UTF-8, of course, and I'm going to console.log new content. So whenever there's a change, I'm going to console.log the new contents that have been saved to the file. And notice only when it's saved that this fires. And you can do a lot of things here, like in production, you can check the content when it's changed and then, do something with the new content that's been added or something like that. But as long as the listen actually happens, as long as like you're listening to a file, you can actually do whatever you want to do with that file when it is changed in real time. So I can just run this code again, say node watch. My bad. Okay, it's still called things I hate. That's true. Funny. So I'll just rename it to things I love again. So of course it threw an error. It throws an error if the file doesn't exist, which is a good thing. So I'm going to run node watch again by just pressing the up key. Node watch, and I'm going to come here and say bread and save. You can see I have the new logged in here, bread, including bread, and I'm going to say rice. Save. You can see I have rice logged in here. So you can do new things with this content. You can create new logs that, oh, this file has been updated in the backend to save it to a form of database, which we'll look into in the future. But you can just begin to see the world of things you can do with this if it's being changed in real time, and your server can effectively listen to these real-time changes and perform actions based on the real-time changes that occur to a particular file on your server. So that is pretty powerful. Of course, there are much more things to discuss with the FS module, but these are the main things that you probably will be using. Maybe some of you won't be using that much, but these are the major things you're certainly going to be using when working with Node.js. So that's where I'm going to end it. So yep, that's it for the video and file system module in Node.js. We've covered reading, writing, appending, deleting, working with directories, working with file changes. Whew, a lot. In the next video, we'll explore the HTTP module and learn how to create a basic web server. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.